Well, everyone, welcome to this first church history class for 2017. Let's start things off correctly, and let's go to the Lord in prayer, and let's just have Him be here with us. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity. We thank you so much for giving us a place to meet, giving us the ability to be here, Lord, allowing our lives to open up just a little bit and make room for this time that you have set aside for us. Lord, we ask your Spirit to be in this place with us. Lord, I ask you to be with each person here. And Lord, I just ask that our hearts are open, that we're soft and we're ready. And Lord, that you would just work a mighty work through what you have gathered here for the next few months. And Lord, we just ask it all in your name. Amen. All right, so everybody has their book, right? This history of the church. This book is very easy reading. It's going to be more like reading a novel than it is like reading a history book, like traditionally like in school. So if you can, from the very first time that you open it and you begin reading it, think of it as a story. You're really reading it is going to be broken up into eras and certain time frames and things like that, but really we're starting with where the book of Acts sort of leaves off, and we are just going to flow through history at the pace that we can, and we're going to pick up what we can along the way until we arrive to the present day. So enjoy the reading that you're doing. Give yourself time to be able to comprehend it and just sort of soak in it a little bit. It'll be good. So I have some statistics as far as Christianity in this country or in the world. And you know how statistics are. It's funny, you can go on the internet and you can find all kinds of pie charts and graphs and whatevers. But most of the time, and I'll be giving you some statistics like this, most of the time, if you scrutinize those websites to find out how they gathered their data, they don't tell you. And it's very interesting. I mean, they have all kinds of grandiose like percentages and numbers and beautiful graphs and whatever, but they don't give you any indication about, how did they come to that conclusion? How many people did they ask? In what country did they ask? In what population did they talk to? All of these things influence the sort of answers that a person would give on a census, right? So anyway, bear in mind that all of this is relative, right? This will not be on any sort of test. I'm just laying some groundwork here. So in 2013, I think thereabouts, there was a poll that I found on the web that there were 2,184,000 Christians worldwide. Okay, of that population in America, 80% of those were claiming Christianity. Now, in 2015, that same poll dropped from 80% in this country down to 75%. And most of that 75% is represented by older people. And when I say older, I mean probably 40s and older, somewhere in that general range. Of that population, that same population, only 62% of the people who are aged 18 to 29 years claim Christianity. So, by that statistic, one thing you might draw as an idea, not a conclusion, but an idea, is that Christianity is popular with the older folks, and it's becoming less and less popular with the young folks. So why is that? There are some other statistics that I found on the web. These numbers sound incredible, but when you think about the world population, they're pretty small. In 2014, the largest. Now this is worldwide, not in our country. According to this article, which did not tell you how it got its numbers, so take it for what it's worth. The largest organized religion in the world was Christianity, and it had 2 billion people claiming Christianity. Now that's across all kinds of denominations and theologies, and that is a very generic term. The second largest, falling at 1.2 billion, which about half, a little more than half, was Islam, followed by Catholicism, which I think is interesting that it was pulled out of Christianity. I don't know how they did that, but they did it. Anyway, with 1.1 billion. So if you were to add Catholicism and Christianity together, you're up at 3 billion. Then followed by Hinduism, and they threw in agnosticism and atheism and some other things, and it just keeps going. Judaism was 12th on that list with 14.5 million people worldwide. That's 2014. 2017, just 3 years later, Christianity is, now this Christianity, again, no statistics on no explanation on how they came up with these numbers. But Christianity, just generically speaking, still at about 2.3 million. But that includes Catholics, whereas the first set of statistics did not. So if you could draw the conclusion that Christianity has dropped by 1 billion, but again, we don't even know where these numbers came from or how they were derived. So all of this is cloud talk. Like none of this is something you take to the bank. But anyway, the largest organized religion in the world, still Christianity. 32% of the world population claims Christianity, followed by Islam, 23%. Followed by Hinduism, 15%, Buddhism, 7%, and then on and on. Judaism, 0.3% of the world population. So when you hear it in terms of 0.3% as opposed to, what did I say a second ago, 14.5 million, but see, 14.5 million on a worldwide population scale probably is about 0.5%. So those are just statistics to kind of lay a groundwork. And it's interesting. I can't remember if the book says something about this or not. But definitely, if you Google Christianity in the world, or however you want to phrase it, what you will find, especially if you put 2017, the year 2017, in that search somewhere, you're going to find that there are predictive websites that they're trying to predict based on population dynamics and some other things like that, what religion, because it's a race, what religion is going to be, in the lead, or who's going to be the largest worldwide religion in, so many years or whatever. Well, the perspective, though, is not so much how are the religions going to change or maneuver or work, or, like this. The perspectives of those websites, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, are that Islam is going to overstep Christianity easily, depending on the website you look at, either by 2035, 2050, or the most popular, 2070. The reason that is cited in most of those, generically speaking, the reason is that more people are raising their children. More Muslims or Islamic people are having children and raising them in that faith than Christians are having children and raising them in that faith. So just population-wise, it's starting to teeter. Now, if you talk to evangelical sources, if you know any, and you talk to those, they are skeptical about that whole topsy-turvy thing happening within the next 50 years or 75 years or whatever. Who knows? I'm just telling you that is the sort of the skew of where we are now, and at least the perspective, the popular perspective, media-wise, on where things are heading. So I tell you that because I want us to, so part of the purpose behind this class is to equip you, obviously, but we all want to know why we believe what we believe. We want to know not just that we believe something, but we want to know why we believe it. And we want to understand our foundations and our roots. And we want to, even though our roots are really ugly, the history of the church is really not very pretty. People are mean and they are ugly to each other. And our Christian history is no different than any other population group of people that you're going to find if you do a historical perspective on their history. But understanding, not for the purpose of defense and not for the purpose of judgment, but understanding just where something is, where it started, and having some idea about how it came from this thing that by all rights was sort of a pure or idealistic thing that was brought to somebody by God. Somebody was truly blessed and was given the grace of God to do these wonderful things. But then somehow, as things happen, things sometimes end up getting twisted, or theologies start getting a little weird. And then for people much like myself several years ago, I mean, you don't know what to believe. I mean, if the person who's talking to you, if you trust them, you're going to believe what they say. And you may go, well, that sounds a little fishy, but you're not going to immediately think, oh, psh, and just start blowing them off. And now, if it's somebody you don't like, okay, that's fine. Or if it's about a topic you don't like, sure, we can blow that off. But when you trust somebody and you trust a church or a pastor or a friend or a spouse or a child or, whatever, what they say influences how you view everything. This class is going to allow you to be an influencer. And if it's true to what it's meant to be, you will be doing it in truth and in purity and in a way that is honoring God. So that's really what we want. So whenever we are talking about Christianity, Pastor Khan has talked about this several times for those of you that have been to some of his more recent teachings. He talks about the difference between having a true relationship with Jesus and this idea of what he's kind of coined as the American Jesus. And I'm not sure he coined that. I think that has been around for a while, that term. But this idea that you can claim and say what you want, but where your heart is where God's going to be. And of this, 32% of the world population, or these, 2 billion people that we're, statistically talking about, of those, very, very, very few are going to have an understanding of why they believe what they believe or what their history is. And so with this very small group of people, we're going to start to change things a little bit. So in the preface of your book, I'm just going to read this one thing that ties into this quite nicely. If you'd like to look at it with me, you may. It's the prologue. It's on page 6, the Roman numeral, the X followed by the small I. I'm going to start in the second paragraph. I'm going to skip some of the wording, but this is I think a synopsis of what I'm trying to introduce to you. I think it's said well here. Many Christians today suffer from historical amnesia. The time between the apostles and their own day is one giant blank. That is hardly what God had in mind. Now I'm going to skip down to the next paragraph. As a consequence of our ignorance concerning Christian history, we find believers vulnerable to the appeal of cultists. Some distortion of Christianity is often taken for the real thing. And there's that trust. I mean, and the person who does this may not even be doing it maliciously. I mean, most people are not trying to hurt other people, but anyway, at the same time, other Christians reveal a shocking capacity for spiritual pride or hubris. Without an adequate base for comparison, they spring to the defense of their way as the best way, or their party as the superior party. And finally, many Christians engage in some form of ministry without the advantage of a broader context for their labor. And that ties so nicely into, again, what Pastor Khan talks about so often with, whenever you're going to be in a ministry, I mean, even in this class to some degree, but when you're going to be in a ministry, you're there serving God. You're there to figure out what God wants you to do to further his kingdom and what God needs you to do to further or to edify his children, right? That's what we're here for. And whenever you're working or you're doing ministry or coming to class or, whatever, fill in the blank, and you're doing it for example, for Pastor Khan, for your spouse, for your child, so that other people think that you are here instead of here, or, whatever it is that we think. We get all crazy, right? Yeah, we just get all whacked out and we start thinking strange things that no one is thinking at all. No one thinks any of that, but we think they think that. We want to make sure that I want everyone by the end of this class. I mean, you're coming into this class believing what you believe. This is not a theology class. This is not a Bible class. This is not any of those things. This is a class to help you understand where Christianity came from, where it went, where it's going, where it is, and how you fit into all of that, how your legacy is part of that history. So that's what we're going to do. So about 2,000 years ago, there was a Jewish man who showed up on the scene in the Judean province, and he claimed to be a teacher of God, although many looked at him as a rebel against Rome. Many Jews, however, listened to his teaching. They ended up leaving everything they had. They left their homes, their families, their jobs, everything that they knew and every bit of security they had to follow him, questioning, could this man be the promised Messiah? Eventually, this man was horrifically executed by the Roman government and his followers dispersed. Who do you think that is? See, I set you up. I totally set you up. Anyway, it's actually a man named Theudas. And in 46 AD, he gathered a band of people and claimed to be the Messiah, rebelled against Rome. Rome absolutely crushed him. I mean, he died a terrible death, the sort of death you die when you go against Rome at that time. And his followers dispersed and disappeared. There are many examples of this. None of these are going to be on a test. I'm just giving some examples. There is a man named Athronges from 4 to 2 BC. He did the same thing. This man, Simon of Perea, in the 4th century. Judas the Galilean in the 6th century. A man named Simon bar Kokhba in 135 AD. All of these. So throughout history, there have been people who have claimed messiahship, who have rebelled against governments and claimed to have the answer in the truth. But the thing that makes our founder, our Jesus, different from what these men were claiming is that while he claimed his own messiahship eventually, not at first, but eventually Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. When he was killed by the government, like all of these other people were killed by the government, and his people at the beginning, his disciples were dispersed. They were distraught and very upset and didn't know what to think or do. The difference is that he resurrected. And after that, his disciples got back together, formed again, and there was nothing that was going to stop them from proclaiming his deity, his messiahship, and his gospel to everyone they found. That is the difference. The people who were following these other people, following men, whenever that man was killed, they were out of there. That was the end of it. Whenever Jesus was killed, they also did the same thing. They were very distraught. They did not expect him to die. That was not the Jewish perspective on what the Messiah was going to do. But whenever he resurrected, and he did so in such a public way, many, many, many people, secular and otherwise, witnessed this. Then they came together, and all of these men, except John, he didn't die a horrible, awful death, but many bad things happened to him along the way. He got boiled in oil and, shipped off to Patmos and whatever. But all of these men went to their deaths. They were willing to go to their deaths because they knew what they knew, what they knew. And they believed it, they lived it, and they carried on. And that is the foundation of who we are. That is the foundation of the Christian church. And it's an incredible foundation. It's something that's really, really incredible. So, this church history class, let's get a little bit of some definitions here. So, what is history? You guys may have a hard time seeing. If you need to move, you can. I'll try to move out of the way so you can see. So, what is Uh-oh, I picked up the wrong thing again. Sorry, you guys. Apparently, I like blue. All right. What is history? All right. There are two aspects of history that I want you to know. One is called the historical process. The other is called historiography. Okay, so the historical process, these are the actual events that really happened. They were recorded, they were witnessed. These are actual historical events. The historiography is what is written about those events. Okay, so the two together, the event and then what is written about the event, basically makes up what history is. That is the definition. Now, there are, as you all probably know, there are often discrepancies between what actually happens, the historical process, and then what's recorded about what happens, right? Like, there's just stuff all over the place. Anyone who's played that game where you whisper something in the phrase in this ear and it goes around the room, by the time it comes back, we're not even talking about the same people. Like, I don't even know where that came from, right? So that happens with actual history and what's recorded about it. Why do these discrepancies exist? So why are there discrepancies? Oops, and if you can't read my writing, I apologize. Why are there discrepancies between these things? So there are two reasons that we're going to talk about, two reasons that these things can be discrepant, okay? One is the evidence. Oops. And two is the historian. All right, so let's break this down a little bit. Let's talk first off about the evidence. There are, within this category, there are three reasons that the evidence can become a problem. Okay, three reasons. I'm just going to label them first and then we'll talk about them, okay? The first is time, which I'll explain. The second is the history is fragmented. And the third, the historic information is not always reliable. Now, we're going to talk about each of these so that they seem like they're almost saying the same thing, but we're going to talk about them. All right, so time. Why would time affect discrepancies between what happens and what's talked about or what's written about? The longer the time is between the actual event and then what is written about the event, the more discrepancy you're going to have. All right, if you have an eyewitness as opposed to somebody who's great-grandfather witnessed, and it's oral history going down through their family. It's not so much that the evidence is purposely distorted, but even in this place, I could pull one person aside and tell them a story. Like I could read it off of a piece of paper, word for word. Then I could pull another person into a different room, read the exact same story, word for word, bring them together and say, what did you hear? And very likely the gist is going to be the same. Like everyone's going to get the understanding of what the point of the story was, but the evidence behind it is going to be a little bit discrepant. So it's really easy to see that if we can have a conversation and see it in real time, it's very easy to see how actual time can cause a problem. All right, so historical information is often fragmented, and that can even be a branch off of this time between when it happened and when it was talked about or when it was written about. But historical evidence is often fragmented. When they whoever finds a historical document, it's not in a pristine library. It's usually buried underground and has been for hundreds of years. So when they pull it out, things are broken, things are smeared, pieces are gone. And so there are literal fragments to what the historical document has contained within it. There is a very famous set of fragments called Papias fragments. Those are from a Christian historian, Papias, and they are all history, and my understanding is it's accurate history, but it's fragmented. You can only get little pieces here and there because his works are not complete. So what is there, you can pretty much take to the bank. You don't need to worry about what you're reading, but you're not going to get the complete picture from it. Then this third thing, the historic evidence is not always reliable. So from this, and I'm sorry that this is happening this way, from this point, there are two reasons that the information isn't always reliable, and it has to do with who is telling you the information. Okay? You can have either a primary source, meaning somebody who was there, right? Or you can have a secondary source. And that's basically somebody who is doing the research and checking as much history as they can find and basing a conclusion around all of the evidence that they can find, right? Well, you would think that a primary source would not cause a discrepancy between these things, right? Because you say it. But just like I said with our conversation example, even what you see is distorted. And the reason it's distorted, and this is just the human condition, it's not, it's just who we are and what happens. But these primary sources are very seriously affected by what their life is about, how they grew up, what culture they were in, what their belief system was that they grew up in, what happened to them in their life. Were they traumatized? Were they not traumatized? All of these things. What is the political environment? How is that political environment affecting their parents, their siblings, their friends? All of that. Everything that you experience, unfortunately, biases your opinion. So whenever you are a primary and you're watching something, it's very, very difficult to cut your bias out and simply report the fact of whatever it is you're talking about. It's very difficult to do that, especially when you start talking about matters of religion. It's just like matters of politics. When you start talking about a deep-seated belief system that carries you through your life, it's very difficult not to be influenced by that whenever you're talking about whatever you're talking about, right? So I have a very interesting example of a primary source. So there is this document called the Document of Constantine. Okay? The Document of Constantine is basically a document that was supposedly written by Emperor Constantine, who we will talk about a little bit later on. We'll talk about him quite a bit, actually. But it was supposedly penned by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century when he lived. And it gave the Catholic Church ownership of vast territories in Italy. Those territories are commonly referred to as the Papal States. Okay? This document states that Constantine gave this land to the church as kind of a thank you. Pope Sylvester I was the Pope at the time, and it was out of gratitude that Constantine gave this land to him because he was apparently responsible for Constantine's conversion to Christianity. That's what the document says. And also that he was healed, Constantine was healed of leprosy. So this giving of the land is an act of gratitude, right? Well, in 756 AD, so that was supposedly written in the 4th century. So now we're going to the 8th century, okay? In the 8th century, this man named King Pepin of the Franks, which we'll mention briefly when we get to that era, gave this land to the church and said, this belongs to us, or I can give this to you because of this document, right? Well, the people that were around him, okay, so basically what happened, Pepin was going to give this land to the church, but it was always a catch. Like, he was giving him this gift, but he expected the church in return to fill in the blank, whatever that is. Tax relief, whatever, right? Employ people of his choosing, whatever, some sort of benefit, right? The church did not want to owe the king that kind of debt. They didn't want to be in debt to the king to that degree, because it's a lot of land. I mean, it's a big piece of land. So what the church did was they said, we've got this document that says it belongs to us anyway. You can't give us something we own. So, forget that. That's not going to work out, right? Well, he asked for proof of this documentation. Like, he said, well, let me see the letter, right? Let me see the document. So they did. They produced the document in the 8th century, and it was supposedly written 400 years earlier, right? Well, let's see, about 700 years later, in 1440, doesn't matter, you don't have to have that written down, there's a man named Lorenzo Valla. He did a historical search or whatever of this document, sort of, what is it called whenever you're looking at something for its, there's a word for it.
Research?
No, whenever they're like seeing if something is fake or not, like they're doing, they're what? Authenticity. He did an authenticity study on this document. And he found, and he published a paper to this fact. So in 1517, so let's get these dates straight. It was supposed to be written in the 4th century. It was produced in the 8th century. And then in the 16th century, or the 15th century, excuse me, in the 15th century, a document came out by this Mr. Valla. He wrote a paper that said, this thing is a total forgery. This document was not produced in the 4th century. And you can actually look it up. You can find pages and pages and pages. You can find the actual document online. It's very interesting to read. Some of the easier to understand, at least for me, evidences, I'm just going to give you a few. This land of Byzantia was referred to as a province, which in the 8th century, it was called a province. But in the 4th century, it was a teeny, teeny, tiny little nothing that wasn't even really on the map. And so because it was so small, it would not have been mapped, and it certainly wouldn't have been called a province. The diadem that is mentioned in this document is stated to be made of gold, when in the 8th century, they were made of gold, but in the 4th century, they were made of cloth. it's a piece of material, like a crown, or sometimes it can be a covering around the clothing here. They use the term Judea to describe Israel, but the 4th century Romans described Israel as Palestine. 2 more. It refers, now this was just bad form. The rest of them, you have to do some research to figure it out, but this is just bad form right here. This document refers to Roman temples that didn't exist in the 4th century. Whoops. Yeah, that was kind of a bad thing. And the last thing is that, okay, Constantine was an emperor. When we talk about Constantine, phenomenal. Like, this dude made some history. Like, he did some stuff, right? He was not somebody who was lurking around in the corner with people going, well, who's Constantine? People knew who he was. Lots of history written about him. Not one document has been found, to my understanding, that states that Constantine ever had leprosy that he needed to be cured from, which was half the reason that the land was given in the first place, right? So whatever. So that is an example of, it's called an original forgery, and it's a primary source forgery, where someone claims to have been witness to something, they document it, blah, 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 and then apparently 700 years later, it gets blown out of the water, right? So that was done for political reasons. As far as we can tell, that was a political move. It wasn't because the church wanted to steal land or whatever. The church wanted to stay out from under the thumb of the king. So that was the way to do it. And just to kind of close the loop on that, I'm not sure if we'll talk about it again. So this document was basically well hidden and well preserved by the church for a long time. But after this 1517 publication of how incredibly forged it was, like there was no doubt that this was a forgery, the church, conceded that it was a forgery, and the Papal States went back to Italy. That was in 1929 under a treaty called the Lateran Treaty. So none of that is going to be on a test. That's just closing the loop. So that's an example of a primary source bias. Secondary source biases are a little bit easier to understand, and it's just like what I said. I sort of already went through it. Whoever it is that is gathering the information, whoever it is that's talking about whatever they're talking about when they write, and I am as guilty of this as anybody else. We put our own biases in. We put our own belief systems in. We edge onto the things that we love more, and we sort of shy away from or ignore the things we don't love as much. It's just the way it is, and that's just the human condition. It doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's justified, but it is what it is. So as we go through this, and even as we read this book, or as you go into your future and you perhaps read other things, or whatever you're doing, you have to remember that everything has a bias. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, and it doesn't mean that it's a lie, but there are always biases built into the things that you read. And unfortunately, that's part of knowing who you are, knowing what your perspective is, and knowing why you believe what you believe, is to try to scrutinize, without being rude, but scrutinize what you're reading, and really believe whatever it is that you project to people. All right, so I don't have very much time. We're going to do this super fast. So I said this is going to be short. Does everybody have what they need here? All right, so the last thing I want to go through real quick is this perspective of history. I'm going to give you a couple of perspectives of history. One is a sort of a philosophy on history. One philosophy on history is called a cyclic philosophy. I'm going to briefly go through 3 examples of this, very, very briefly. I do want you to know the examples. I do not necessarily expect you to know the details of the examples, because they're kind of hard to understand anyway. Even if you go and look them up and try to figure it out yourself, it's a little bit, it's just kind of hard to understand. One of these cyclic views of history is called the Chinese dynastic cycles. So basically, the Chinese dynastic cycles they have this central view, and all of this is pretty loose. This is what I can gather and what I can understand, so forgive me if I misrepresent, but this is my understanding of how it works. Their central view is based around something called the mandate from heaven. Okay, so God, this entity, is giving this mandate, basically. And what happens is the mandate is given to a family or a dynasty, okay? And whenever this dynasty is given this power, it's very good. They do good things, lots of wealth for the land. The people flourish, the land flourishes. Everybody, it's sort of a kumbaya sort of situation for quite some time. They run well, they're honest, they're fair. The people are being paid for what they're, fair wages. Everything is doing well. And that goes on for a period of time. But then as time progresses through the cycle, corruption starts coming into the government. The leaders start, for example, to get greedy, or they start, or as an example of greed, they stop paying fair wages and begin to employ child labor. I don't know, whatever. They just begin to forget the moral fiber that this mandate of heaven expected them to maintain by giving them the gift of the dynasty or of the success of the dynasty. And the corruption grows and grows. The people begin to rebel. The land stops flourishing. The people stop flourishing. Things just start going by the wayside. When that dynasty reaches the point where it's just too corrupt, that mandate is removed from them. That dynasty dies out, and a new dynasty comes up, and the mandate is given to them. And there are just different time frames for all of these things, but that's basically the cycle, and it just goes around and around, and it just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. So basically, the final view of these dynastic cycles, if you look at it sort of a bird's eye view, is that everything that begins is going to come to an end. Everything that starts and flourishes, at the end of the day, the destiny is it is going to end, and it's going to end after, some bad stuff. So that's the summary of a Chinese dynastic cycle. The second I want you to know about is called an Indian dynastic cycle. No, not dynastic, I'm sorry, just an Indian cycle. Hindus follow this. Oh, cosmic, that's the word. Cosmic cycle, Indian cosmic cycle. This is way too difficult for me to even begin to explain, but I'm just gonna give you kind of an overview so that you can, because they actually put time frames on this just so you can kind of get an idea. So there are 4 ages. The first age is called the dawn of the age, and it lasts 400 years for the dawn. Then you have 4,000 divine years, and it gets really complicated. This 4,000 divine years, when you try to understand what a divine year is, a divine year can be 130,000 solar years or 1.728 million human years. Years. Okay, so we're talking a huge time frame. No one's living through any one of these cycles, right? So the first age is 400 years, 4,000 years, and then another 400 years as a twilight. So that's the first age. The second age follows the same pattern, except that it's 300 years twilight, 3,000 years of the focus of the age, and then 300 years of twilight. The next age, 200, 2,000, 200. And then the fourth age, 100, 1,000, and 100. And with each cycle, you'll notice it starts with, 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, 1,000. Part of the cycling through these ages is kind of the same idea of the Chinese thing. As the time moves on, as the ages move through, it starts to decline. It starts to go into corruption. It starts to do this and starts to do that. But we're talking 1.7, what did I say? 1.7 million years per one divine year. And we're talking 4,800 of those years. Like, that's a long time, right? So anyway, that's how those Indian cosmic cycles work. And then at the end, everything is super, super chaotic by the time you get to the twilight of the final age. Very, very chaotic. And the entire cycle ends and then begins again. It's the idea of reincarnation. That cycle ends, and you just begin again. Okay? So the overall view of this cycle is that it tends to, just generically speaking, it tends to breed passivity. Because if you already know that what you're doing, it depends on your personality, but if you already know that what you're doing, you're just going to end up having another opportunity to make it better in another life, or you have another chance, you tend to not try so hard. I mean, you may at first, but then when you blow it, which we all do, then, you just kind of lose your oomph, and then you're just going to give it another try later. So this tends to breed passivity. Okay? This kind of has a gloomy ending, like that the really good thing's going to end. This one, you just kind of like, well, I'll just try it again. I'll try it again later, right? The final cycle is called a Middle East or Persian cycle. This one is the hardest for me to try to explain because the least data. I had a very hard time. I've tried, a couple of years now to try to find good data on this, and I just can't. What I can find on it, and what Pastor Khan has helped me with, is basically they also have 4 ages. They are broken down into gold, silver, bronze, and iron, just like the book of Daniel, by the way, but whatever. Anyway, they're broken down into different ages, again, starting with the most precious metal and moving down through the preciousness of those metals, indicating decline, although I cannot find literature that states that. But it just by the way that the metals decline, I assume that the cycle declines. And basically, what this cycle believes is that whenever you reach the end, that's it. There's no second chances. There's no new dynasty that's going to come around, nothing. Whenever this ends, it's over. There is nothing after this. So this one tends to make, I don't know. It seems kind of depressing. Like you have nothing, there's no hope at all in this belief system, right? Now, this is what's called the cyclic view of history, and it's 3 examples of that. It's not inclusive. There's other things. Now, in the 1 minute that I'm already over, very quickly, this is super important. This is probably going to be on every single test that I give you starting next week, because I love this concept. This is not a Christian's perspective on history. None of these are a Christian's perspective on history. The Christian perspective on history revolves around this word. Providence. Providence is a one-word way of saying God is in control. I'm not going to keep you late to give these to you. We'll start the lecture at Providence next time. I promise you this will be on your test next week, and probably every single test you take. Because this is the center of everything. God is in control. And I'm going to go through these very quickly, so I'm not expecting you to write it down. This part will not be on the test. We'll start with the lecture next time on this. But there are 3 convictions that revolve around God being in control. One is that God guides in a straight line. He doesn't guide in chaos. He doesn't guide in cycles. He guides with intent and purpose. And it is his will and it is straight. He knows exactly where he's going. He doesn't veer. Okay? God, because he is in control, he is going to bring history or his story, right? He's going to bring history to his conclusion in his time. Okay? So he guides in a straight line and he brings his history to a planned conclusion. It is not going to be a surprise. He's going to have everything worked out. And the most incredible thing, this is the best part, and this is everything we're going to talk about for the rest of the year. The third thing is that God intervenes in history. Amazing. He intervenes in these global ways, like that we get to be a part of, like whenever Moses and the burning bush, right? Paul on the road to Damascus. Like those are major interventions from God that we get to be a part of because they're written down for us, right? And then, of course, the big intervention, Christ coming, God coming in, I mean, that's the big intervention. But even individually, like all of us have had God intervening in our lives at some point or another. We can all look back in our history. I mean, even what may seem like the smallest thing. I remember I stayed up all night long in college. I was super tired. I had stuff due, turned it in the next day, got one of those obnoxiously sized thermoses of coffee that you can get at like 7-Eleven. I mean, seriously, like 44 ounces, right? It's obnoxious. Got one of those, put it in the car, started driving from my house in Socorro, where I was going to school, to my mom's house in Roswell. Because I had to go home. Like we had plans. So I did not have my daughter with me, by the way, as a caveat to the story, because God is good. But anyway, so I'm driving home and I'm super tired. Like I am doing everything I can to stay awake, right? I don't know how, you guys probably may not know the road, but when you leave Socorro, you go through a small town called Capitan, and then another small town called Lincoln, and then you end up at an intersection with Highway 70, where you have to turn right or left, right? Like there's no throughway. Well, sometime after Capitan, but before that intersection, I have no memory of anything, and I woke up sitting at that stop sign with my blinker on. I don't remember. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I was not driving that car. That's what I can tell you. God intervened in my life. Why he did it, I don't know. But he did, and I am grateful for it. Now that's, sort of a spine-tingling thing, but it doesn't have to be something like that. I mean, the very heartbeat I have, God is intervening in my life. The very breath I breathe, he's intervening in my life. I mean, this class, he's intervening in my life. So I love providence. It is the center of everything. So we're going to end with that. I'm sorry I kept you 5 minutes extra, but we will begin with that concept next week. All right? Your homework is the first 2 chapters of the book. Yes, page 1 through page 25. So your quiz next week will entail especially the written things, because, and what you read in your book. Be a short quiz over those 2 things. Okay? And that is it. Thank you, guys, and we'll see you next week.